Are you ready to witness a tale of courage that will leave you speechless? Are you sure you can serve people like us without contaminating the food? The question cut through the silence of the Grandview Country Club's main hall like a sharp blade. Jonathan Sterling, 52, CEO of Sterling Industries and a lifetime member of the city's most exclusive club, looked with contempt at the new waitress who had just approached his table. His $3,000 suit and limited edition Swiss watch contrasted starkly with the simple uniform she wore. Kesha Williams, 28, held the tray tightly in her hands and took a deep breath. It was her first day in the sanctuary of white privilege, and she already knew it wouldn't be easy. But she never imagined the humiliation would begin so soon and so directly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I didn't understand your question," she replied calmly, looking him straight in the eye. Around her, the conversation stopped. Other club members discreetly turned to watch the scene like spectators waiting for a gladiator show. "Get ready, this confrontation is about to take an unexpected turn." Jonathan laughed loudly, a harsh sound that echoed through the room with its fine wood and expensive crystal. "Of course, you didn't understand. People like you rarely understand subtleties." He turned to the two men dining with him. "Gentlemen, look at this. They've hired another one for the diversity program. I bet she doesn't even know the difference between a Bordeaux and a Burgundy." His companions laughed nervously, but Kesha remained motionless. Her dark eyes maintained a disturbing serenity, as if this were not her first battle. In fact, anyone who knew her story would know that she had weathered much worse storms. "Mr. Sterling," she said, pronouncing his name with a precision that made him frown. "May I suggest the 1982 Chateau Margaux? It perfectly matches the aged arrogance you are serving tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan Sterling, accustomed to being flattered and feared in equal measure, was momentarily speechless. His dinner companions exchanged uncomfortable glances. "How dare you," he began, his face reddening with anger. "Or," Kesha continued, ignoring the interruption, "if you prefer something more accessible to your palate, we have an excellent Kendall Jackson. Nothing too sophisticated, but perfect for someone who confuses money with class." Then something extraordinary happened. Across the room, some of the older waiters, all white, all accustomed to bowing their heads in the face of Sterling's insults, began to slowly approach her, not to support her, but out of pure morbid curiosity. Jonathan Sterling didn't know it yet, but he had just awakened something that had been dormant for a long time. Kesha Williams wasn't just another employee trying to survive in a hostile environment. She was a born strategist who had studied every member of that club, every weakness, every dirty secret hidden behind respectable facades. As Sterling rose from his chair, clearly losing control, Kesha maintained that serene smile that only exists in those who have faced hell and decided to turn it into fuel. What that powerful man didn't know was that his own arrogance had just signed the first document of his destruction. And if you're wondering how a simple waitress could stand up to one of the most influential men in town, don't forget to subscribe to the Black Voices channel because this story of courage and justice is just beginning. And what comes next will show that underestimating the wrong person can cost much more than Sterling ever imagined. The tension in the main hall of the Grandview Country Club was palpable. Jonathan Sterling stood red-faced with indignation while the other members watched the scene with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Never in the club's 53-year history had anyone dared to talk back to a board member like that. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Sterling said, his voice low and threatening. "I built half this town. My company employs 2,000 people. One phone call from me and you'll never work again." Kesha maintained her calm demeanor, but her eyes flashed with something Sterling couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, you didn't build anything. Your employees built it. Your workers built it. You just signed checks with money you inherited from your grandfather." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of a chair being pushed back. Margaret Whitmore, the federal judge's wife, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Someone needs to put that person in her place." Then Kesha did something no one expected. She laughed. Not a nervous or forced laugh, but a genuine hearty laugh, as if she had just heard the best joke in the world. "My place," she repeated, still smiling. "Ma'am, my place is wherever I decide it is." And today, my place is serving you. Tomorrow, well, tomorrow may be different. The club manager, Thomas Blackwell, appeared almost running. He was a nervous man in his 50s who had dedicated his entire life to keeping the members happy. His face was pale with terror. "Miss Williams, please come with me immediately," he said, trying to keep his voice down. "I need to speak with you privately." "Of course," Kesha replied, never taking her eyes off Sterling. "But first, let me finish serving these gentlemen. After all, the customer is always right, isn't he?" She turned to Sterling's companions, who looked petrified. "Gentlemen, may I suggest an appetizer? We have fresh oysters from Cape Cod. Or if you prefer something more familiar, we have nachos at the bar." The provocation was deliberate and well-aimed. Nachos at a club that prided itself on serving only haute cuisine was a calculated insult. Sterling clenched his fists. "You're fired," he declared, pointing his finger at her. "Don't even finish your shift. Get out now." "Interesting," Kesha replied, tilting her head slightly. "But you're not my boss. You're just a customer. A very rude customer, by the way." It was at that moment that something in Kesha's demeanor changed subtly. Her voice remained professional, but there was a firmness behind her words that made some of those present shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Thomas Blackwell was sweating now. The Grandview Country Club depended on donations and fees from its most influential members, and Sterling was the biggest contributor. One word from him to the board and the manager would lose his job. "Miss Williams," he tried again. "Please, Thomas," Sterling interrupted without taking his eyes off Kesha. "Either she leaves now or I'm withdrawing my family from this club permanently, and I'll be taking at least 10 other families who feel the same way with me." The threat hung in the air like a sword over everyone's head. Blackwell looked as if he was about to faint. The other waiters watched from a distance, some with pity, others with relief that they weren't the ones in the center of the storm. But Kesha remained motionless, as if Sterling's threats weren't directed at her. There was something about her calmness that deeply disturbed everyone present. It was as if she knew something they didn't. "You know, Mr. Sterling," she said finally. "You're right about one thing. You've built a lot in this town." She paused, letting a small smile appear at the corner of her mouth. "The question is, are you sure you built it all within the law?" The effect was immediate. Sterling turned visibly pale, and his tablemates exchanged confused glances. There was something about the way she asked the question, not as a vague accusation, but as someone with specific information. "What are you talking about?" Sterling asked, but his voice had lost some of its previous arrogance. Kesha simply smiled and adjusted her tray. "Oh, just general observation, sir. After all, in a small town like this, people tend to talk a lot. And I listen." Each new humiliation Sterling tried to impose only strengthened something inside her that her oppressors couldn't see. A silent strength fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose. What those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat. And Kesha Williams wasn't just a waitress trying to survive. She was someone who had come there with a very specific purpose. The silence in the main hall of the Grandview Country Club was broken by the firm voice of Thomas Blackwell. "Miss Williams, I'm afraid I must accept Mr. Sterling's request. You are dismissed effective immediately." Kesha nodded as if she had expected this outcome. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. Just allow me to collect my things from the locker room." Her disturbing calm contrasted with the visible agitation of everyone around her. Sterling crossed his arms, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "Finally, people like her need to learn their place in society." He turned to his table companions. "Gentlemen, we can finally have dinner in peace." But as Kesha walked toward the back of the club, something extraordinary happened. From the corner of the room, an elegant voice rose above the murmurs. "What a shame, Thomas." She was the only employee who really knew French wines in this place. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Victoria Ashford, 82 years old, widow of the club's founder and the only person in the place with more influence than Sterling. She sat alone at her usual table, delicately cutting a piece of salmon. "Mrs. Ashford," Blackwell said nervously. "I didn't realize you heard." "Oh, I heard everything," she replied without looking up from her plate. "Especially the part about the 1982 Chateau Margaux. An interesting choice for someone who supposedly doesn't know anything about wine, don't you think?" Sterling felt a growing discomfort, but he kept his composure. "Mrs. Ashford, with all due respect, that person was being completely inappropriate." Inappropriate. Victoria finally looked up, fixing her gaze on Sterling with an intensity that made several members shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "Jonathan, my dear, I have been drinking wine for over 60 years. My late husband built one of the finest private wine cellars on the East Coast, and I can assure you that the young lady's suggestion was absolutely perfect." Kesha, who had stopped near the back door, watched the scene with renewed interest. It was no coincidence that Victoria Ashford had chosen that moment to speak. The two had spoken briefly 3 days earlier when Kesha had her job interview. Besides, Victoria continued, "I found it quite educational to hear someone who has actually studied the history of French wines rather than the shallow talk about expensive brands I usually hear around here." The comment hit Sterling like a public slap in the face. His tablemates avoided looking directly at him, clearly uncomfortable with a shift in the power dynamic. Thomas Blackwell was visibly sweating now. Victoria Ashford wasn't just an influential member. She was the club's largest individual donor and had veto power over all major decisions. "Ms. Ashford," Sterling tried. "Surely you understand that we cannot tolerate employees who disrespect our members." "Disrespect?" Victoria laughed dryly. "Jonathan, I was present when you asked that disgusting question about contaminating the food. If anyone was disrespectful here, it certainly wasn't her." The atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. Other members began whispering among themselves, and some seemed genuinely embarrassed by Sterling's behavior. It was rare to see anyone confront him publicly, and the rebuke came from the most respected person in the club. Kesha took advantage of the moment of confusion to approach again. "Ms. Ashford, I appreciate your kind words, but I understand Mr. Blackwell's position." "Rules are rules." "Nonsense," Victoria declared. "Thomas, I want you to reconsider this decision immediately. This young lady clearly has knowledge that would be valuable to our tasting events." It was then that Kesha played her second card. "Actually, Ms. Ashford, if I may mention, I have an international sommelier certification from the École du Vin in Paris. I studied for 2 years in France before returning to the United States." The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling blinked several times as if he couldn't process the information. A certified sommelier serving tables at the Grandview Country Club was like discovering that the janitor was a neurosurgeon in disguise. "France," repeated Margaret Whitmore, the judge's wife, in a weak voice. "Yes," Kesha replied casually. "I also worked at Lou Bristol in Paris for 18 months. I learned that true knowledge about wine has nothing to do with how much money you have to spend on it." Victoria Ashford smiled for the first time that evening, a smile that mixed satisfaction with something that looked very much like mischievous amusement. "Fascinating, and I'm sure your experiences in France have given you a unique perspective on many things." Victoria's tone suggested layers of meaning that Sterling couldn't quite decipher, but Kesha understood perfectly. During their conversation 3 days earlier, she had discreetly mentioned that she had information about certain irregularities in the business dealings of some prominent members of the club. Thomas Blackwell looked from Sterling to Victoria, clearly torn between two powerful forces pulling him in opposite directions. "Well, perhaps we could reconsider." "No," Sterling said firmly, slamming his fist on the table. "I will not tolerate this ridiculous reversal. Either she leaves or I withdraw my family from this club permanently." It was then that Victoria Ashford did something no one expected. She rose slowly, leaning on her ornate cane, and walked over to Sterling's desk. Her voice when she spoke was low, but every word cut through the air like a blade. "Jonathan, dear, are you really sure you want to turn this into a matter of ultimatums?" She paused, her piercing blue eyes fixed on his. "Because, in my 82 years, I've learned that people who make public threats usually have more to lose than they realize." Sterling swallowed hard. There was something in Victoria's tone that made him realize he was treading on dangerous ground, but his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. "I'm serious, Mrs. Ashford. It's her or me." Victoria smiled again, but this time there was nothing kind about it. "How interesting. Such a definitive choice." She turned to Kesha. "My dear, would you agree to stay for tomorrow night's tasting event? It will be a perfect opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge." Kesha nodded. "It would be an honor, Mrs. Ashford." "Perfect," said Victoria, tapping her cane on the floor once. "Thomas, consider that settled. Miss Williams stays." Sterling stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "Very well, you've made your choice." He threw his napkin on the table and walked toward the door, his companions following nervously. But before leaving, he turned one last time. "This won't end like this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Kesha watched him leave with the same disturbing calm as before. But Victoria Ashford noticed something in the young woman's eyes that made her smile again. It wasn't fear nor relief. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just seen the first piece of a complex plan fall perfectly into place. "My dear," Victoria said softly, approaching Kesha. "Something tells me that tomorrow's event will be much more interesting than anyone imagines." Kesha simply nodded, but inside she knew that Victoria was absolutely right. Sterling had just made his first fatal mistake, completely underestimating a woman who had spent 2 years studying not only French wines, but also how the European elites hid their dirtiest secrets. And in the center of that hall, where privilege had always reigned supreme, something new was taking shape. A perfectly planned storm that Sterling would never see coming until it was too late to seek shelter. The night of the tasting event arrived with an elegance typical of the Grandview Country Club. The main hall had been transformed into a sophisticated space with round tables adorned with crystalline candles, while rare bottles of French wine awaited on illuminated pedestals. Jonathan Sterling arrived accompanied by his wife Catherine and 2 important investors. His presence had been confirmed at the last minute, a decision he would soon regret bitterly. Victoria Ashford, elegant in her navy blue dress, occupied the head table. At her side, Kesha was impeccable in her professional uniform. But there was something different about her posture. She held a tablet discreetly, and her hands did not tremble at all. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, tapping a spoon delicately against a crystal glass. "Tonight, we are pleased to have a certified sommelier to guide our tasting. Allow me to officially introduce Kesha Williams." Sterling rolled his eyes at Catherine, whispering loudly enough to be heard. "What a sham! She probably memorized a few French names on the internet." Kesha smiled serenely and approached the microphone. "Good evening. Before we begin with the wines, I would like to share a fascinating story about how great fortunes can hide dark secrets." A curious murmur rippled through the room. Sterling frowned, but Victoria just smiled as if she knew exactly what was coming. "During my years in France, I worked not only as a sommelier, but also as a consultant for investigations into money laundering through the rare wine market." The words cut through the air like a knife. "I discovered that certain people use wine auctions to move illegal fortunes." The room fell silent. Sterling tried to stand, but Catherine held his arm, whispering for him not to make a scene. Kesha tapped the tablet screen and a projector lit up, displaying documents on the wall. For example, this transaction of $200,000 for a bottle of 1945 Romanée-Conti, purchased by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Sterling turned pale as a sheet. On the screen, clearly visible, was his signature on documents he thought were buried forever. "The shell company belongs to Sterling Industries," Kesha continued with murderous calm. "And interestingly, this purchase was made a week after a public construction contract was awarded to Sterling Industries without proper bidding." That's an invasion of privacy," Sterling finally exploded, rising from his chair. "You have no right to expose private documents." "Private?" Kesha raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Sterling, these documents were obtained through an official investigation by the United States Department of Justice. I am a special agent with the FBI working undercover for the past 6 months." The room exploded in shocked murmurs. Catherine Sterling dropped her wineglass, which shattered on the floor. Thomas Blackwell looked as if he were about to faint. Kesha showed her official identification. Operation Vintage Corruption has monitored money laundering through art and wine auctions. Mr. Sterling, you have moved $3.2 million illegally over the past 2 years. You can't prove anything, Sterling shouted, but his voice trembled. Actually, we can, Kesha tapped the tablet again. We have recordings of your phone conversations with corrupt city officials. We also have complete bank records from the Cayman Islands. Sterling's recorded voice echoed through the hall. The mayor will sign the contract tomorrow, prepare the transfer to the usual account, and make sure there are no traces. The effect was devastating. Sterling tried to run toward the exit, but 2 FBI agents who had been disguised as waiters throughout the event blocked his way. Jonathan Sterling, said Kesha, her voice now carrying all the authority of her role. You are under arrest for money laundering, corruption, and fraud against the federal government. As Sterling was handcuffed, he shouted, You planned this. You set me up. Victoria Ashford approached him, her cane tapping firmly on the floor. My dear, you set yourself up. We merely provided the rope. Catherine Sterling wept silently as the investors who had accompanied her husband moved away from him as if he were contagious. Sterling Industries will be thoroughly investigated, Kesha announced to the stunned room. All contracts from the last 5 years will be reviewed. The family's assets have been frozen as of this afternoon. Sterling stopped struggling against the handcuffs and looked directly at Kesha, finally understanding the magnitude of his defeat. Who are you really? Kesha smiled, but there was no cruelty in her smile. Only justice served. I am someone who grew up watching men like you enjoy your impunity while entire families lost their homes because they couldn't pay the taxes that financed your corrupt schemes. She paused, watching him being led toward the door. And I'm also someone who studied hard to gain the competence necessary to take you down legally. As Sterling was led out of the club where he had reigned supreme for decades, the other members watched in silence. Many seemed to be re-evaluating their own actions and words of the past few weeks. Victoria Ashford clapped her hands slowly. Ladies and gentlemen, this has truly been the most educational tasting we have ever witnessed. We have learned that not all poison comes in wine bottles. Sometimes it comes disguised as privilege and arrogance. In the center of that hall, where discrimination disguised as tradition had once reigned, a new reality was now taking shape. True excellence had prevailed over prejudice, proving that justice, when served with intelligence and patience, tastes more satisfying than any rare wine in the world. 6 months after Operation Vintage Corruption, the Grandview Country Club had been completely transformed. What had once been a sanctuary of privilege based on prejudice now operated under new management with strict policies of inclusion and diversity. Jonathan Sterling was serving his 12-year federal prison sentence. His assets have been confiscated to reimburse the public coffers, and Catherine Sterling lived modestly in a rented apartment working as a receptionist. Ironically, being treated by others the same way her husband used to treat employees. Sterling Industries was dismantled and its 2,000 employees were relocated to competing companies operating within the law. The fraudulent contracts were cancelled and new public projects were put out to bid transparently, benefiting dozens of small local businesses. Kesha Williams had been promoted to regional supervisor for the FBI, heading a new division specializing in white-collar financial crimes. Her operation at the Grandview Club became a case study in police academies across the country. Agent Williams has demonstrated that the best weapon against corruption is strategic patience combined with impeccable technical competence, the FBI's regional director said during the award ceremony. She has proven that justice is not revenge. It is the intelligent application of the law. Victoria Ashford, now 83, had become one of the club's biggest advocates for reform. That young woman taught us that tradition without inclusion is just prejudice dressed up as history, she said during an interview with the local newspaper. Thomas Blackwell remained manager, but now he oversaw a completely different environment. The club had implemented scholarship programs for young people from disadvantaged communities interested in food service and hospitality. Ironically, many of the new employees were more qualified than the former members. Most surprising was the discovery that several club members who had previously been silent about Sterling's behavior began to speak out against other forms of discrimination. Margaret Whitmore, the judge's wife, even funded a wine education program for low-income youth. "Sometimes it takes someone brave to take a stand for us to realize our own cowardice," she admitted publicly. Kesha's story spread across social media and national news outlets. Dozens of other minority federal agents began sharing their own experiences of discrimination on the job, creating an awareness movement within the police force itself. The Department of Justice launched a national initiative called Operation Mirror, focused on investigating discrimination and corruption in traditionally exclusive institutions. In less than a year, 12 similar cases were uncovered in different states. Kesha never sought fame or personal recognition. When asked by reporters about her motivation, her response was simple. "I grew up seeing competent people judged by the color of their skin rather than their character. I decided to use my position to ensure that happens less and less." Sterling in his cell occasionally watched the news about the success of the operation that brought him down. His cellmates, many of them victims of the same corrupt system he had helped perpetuate, treated him with the same contempt he had shown others in the past. The irony was perfect. The man who believed that social position defined human worth was now discovering exactly what his true worth was when stripped of all power and privilege. Victoria Ashford in one of her last interviews summed up the lesson perfectly. "Kesha showed us that true class doesn't come from your cradle or your bank account. It comes from how you treat people who can't seem to benefit you. And when we finally meet someone who refuses to accept our disrespect, we discover who we really are." Kesha's greatest victory wasn't just taking down a corrupt man. It was inspiring an entire generation of young people from minority backgrounds to pursue careers in fields where they traditionally weren't welcome, proving that competence and determination always beat prejudice and undeserved privilege. Sterling tried to destroy someone he thought was inferior, but ended up destroying himself. Kesha learned that true revenge isn't getting back at those who hurt you. It's achieving success that your enemies could never imagine and using that success to open doors that others tried to close. If you have faced discrimination or witnessed injustices based on prejudice, leave a comment about how you reacted and subscribe to the Black Voices channel for more stories that prove that in the end, justice always finds a way to prevail, especially when served with intelligence, patience, and impeccable competence.